All right. I have made a statement on occasion that I'm not perfect, though I know some of you may think so. I know you really don't. But one of the ways that you know that I'm not perfect is because what I gave Robbie for the scripture and what's in the bulletin are different. Not vastly different, but a little bit different. And the one in the bulletin is correct. Not vastly different. 18 and 19, John 18 and 19, not 16 through 18. Now, there's nothing Robbie can do about that a whole lot right now. Apologies to him. But I'm going to read verses 18 and 19 of 21, the 21st chapter of John, and then I'm even going to refer to 16 and up. That'll help a little bit, perhaps. Verse 18 of the 21st chapter of John's Gospel. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after this, he said to him, "Follow me." May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Jesus is talking to Peter. That's who the conversation is between. And Jesus is telling Peter, in essence, your choice that we're going to talk about in a moment about following me is going to lead you to a death that is not one of your choosing. Not that we all get to choose, but that he would, in essence, be a martyr. The interpretation that we've had and traditionally for this passage for forever, pretty much. All right, so we're gonna as we look at that, I've been watching news like all of us have, and I've been seeing about all of the kind of the growing strife that we saw like at Charlottesville and other places. Kind of the idea of who's a victim and what does it mean to be a victim, and why do people choose that, and what does even a victim mean? Who is a victim? What do we define that as? And for some crazy reason, this story came into my. It's a true story. It happened, but we remember things sometimes. We don't know why. Back in the late 80s, out in California, I remember this story. There was a chicken truck, a truck delivering chickens to a food processing place. These chickens are about to become food. And there was a wreck. The truck was involved in an accident, and it turned over, and there were 4,000 chickens on this truck. 1,200 chickens died in the accident. 900 were euthanized by lethal injection because they were suffering, and the rest of them were taken onto the food processing place to become meals. Now, there's not a big point about that exactly, but who's the victim? Which chickens were the victims? When you think about it, it just seemed odd to me, if these chickens, I don't know, it just struck me as odd in a way, but when deciding or defining what a victim is not always easy. For instance, with Harvey going on right now, and the people have been caught in those storms and have suffered and have lost homes and all kinds of other circumstances with the economy and infrastructure, there's a ton of things that need to be worked on. And those people are victims of that storm. So we use the word that way. People claim to be victims of oppression. We look back at our own history before the Revolution. We claim to be victims of the oppression of England against us. We were supposed to be British people. We saw ourselves as full British subjects, part of the British Empire. But in England, we were only seen as a colony, as less than whole members of the empire, and basically people who were here to kind of feed the empire's coffers a little bit and to give them a foothold in the new world. So out of that feeling of we are victims of their oppression, we arose in rebellion and revolution, and we became a nation in a different way. Now, did we stay victims, or did we change our destiny? That's one of the things that is a part of how we define things and understanding that. As a part of that picture, before I answer, the Methodist movement in this country, in the territories here, at the time, was in grave jeopardy because John Wesley, always trying to be dutiful, and as a British pastor, John Wesley had issued a a publication. A pamphlet for John Wesley was like a small book for us, but it was about asking the colonies to remain loyal and to remain calm and try to work through these difficulties in peace. And that was seen as an effort to be, he was seen as being a British loyalist and not as someone who favored or supported revolution. He was kind of somewhere in between. In reality, he felt like it was not really fair for us to be treated as we were being, or as we saw ourselves, and he did not really feel like it was either, it also felt like it was not advisable to approach our needs through revolution. The result of that was that all of the pastors who were British pastors in the Methodist movement went back to England, except one whose name was Francis Asbury. He kind of remained in hiding somewhat during the Revolution because his life was in danger, and the Methodist movement was seen as people were suspected of being loyalist to the British for a large degree. And when the war ended, there was, that was the Church of England was a state church, and the Methodists were part of the Church of England officially. So that necessitated a change in how Methodism worked. And for the first time in this country, and with the blessing and the direction of John Wesley, we became a denomination. We became an actual church for the first time. And it was Francis Asbury who came out to lead that church. And when we developed a discipline in our book of laws for Methodism, and our articles of confederation, or articles of the not confederation, but the articles of religion that are part of our constitution in the Methodist Church, the last one was about being loyal to the U.S. and the government. That we were a church that was a part of this enterprise, this new thing called democracy, which went a long way to helping people see we were not British loyalists. We were actually really more about serving God in this place. And amazingly, in a very short time, say by 40 to 50 years later, as many as half the members, half the population of this country was Methodist. We hit that for a short period of time. A victim, I want us to understand a victim as something a little different. A victim is not somebody who necessarily stands up for something that is right, but a victim is, I would like to say victims are people or a person who makes a living out of being downtrodden. Who makes their way by being people who suffer, defining themselves as those who suffer, not those who try to be responsible people or try to take charge of things in a way. But we have a very difficult line to walk in understanding that. So part of what I want us to understand is what that line is. And the reason I chose this passage, I'm going to refer to some others, is this is, I think, where Peter makes this choice. This is the moment where Peter makes his choice, where he follows Jesus or not. Is he going to follow Christ and that invitation? Why is Peter in this situation? Let's start with that. Peter has had a kind of a bumpy road as a disciple. He is the one who first said, you are the living Son of God. You are the one Son of God. And Jesus says, you are the rock, on you I will build my church. High point. There's a big high point, and Peter is recognized for his leadership and his strength. But Peter's kind of a volatile guy in a way, and he also has a great deal of care for Jesus. And so later when Jesus is going to Jerusalem and is explaining to the disciples, I am going to be suffering and I'm going to die, but then I will raise. And Peter doesn't really get all of that. And he says, Jesus, you can't let that happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Eric talked about it a little bit this week. And so here's a little, kind of more of a lower point for Peter. And then later on, he says to Jesus at the Last Supper, I am going to be Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. Peter says, not me, never. I will die with you first. And then it's not too many hours later when Jesus is being questioned at the house of Caiaphas, the chief priest, and Peter's trailed him. And he's kind of checking out what's going on. And someone says, hey, you were one of his people, weren't you? And Peter says, not me. Don't know him. Don't know what you're talking about. Peter's struggling with all this. And so here at the point where Jesus needed him the most, he falls away. He looks to his own self-interest out of fear, out of uncertainty. And then when he gets to this conversation where he's going to make this choice, this is where Jesus has appeared after the resurrection. Some of the disciples have gone back to the Sea of Galilee. They're out fishing. They see Jesus from the water, and Peter recognizes him. And as they head back toward shore, it's like Peter can't wait. He's so anxious to see Jesus. He puts his robe back on and swims back. They fish. They kind of fish they gird their loins. They take their little dress they wear under the robe and they tuck it up so they can fish and work easily. But he throws his robe back on and swims to shore, and it says nothing. He just pulls himself out of the water and stands there in front of him, and then the others catch up. They eat breakfast, and there's that famous conversation, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yes. And Jesus asks him again, and then the third time. 3 times Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter is grieved because Jesus keeps pushing this question, like he doesn't believe him perhaps. And here's a moment where Peter's got to make a decision. Am I going to accept this Jesus' command to follow me or not? This is a moment where Peter has to decide who he really is. This is, I think, his moment when it becomes his time to say, I'm following Jesus, or I'm going to live with the guilt and the self-pity of having failed him. So here's a way that we can understand what it means to be a victim, to live with self-pity or failure that we bring on ourselves, or sometimes that are put upon us for circumstances, and we don't want, we accept that ourselves and live with that as who we are. That becomes our identity. Back in the 60s during civil rights, there were 2 major leaders in terms of who is going to lead efforts to bring equal rights to those people of color. And you had Malcolm X and you had Martin Luther King Jr. And they said 2 very different things about that. One said, black people must rise up and demand equality no matter what is required, even if that meant tremendous violence. That was Malcolm X. The other person said, this is not just about black people, this is about all of us being God's children. Now, there's 2 very different things happening there, aren't there? One person is saying, this is how I look at it, one person is saying, we need to take what we need to get, what was rightfully ours, and we'll take it no matter what the cost. All right. I see a lot of self in that. On the other side, I see someone saying, God did not create anybody to be better or worse than anybody else. He created us all. And if we don't all get there, any of us get there. That's kind of how I heard that in a nutshell. So there is something different going on here. There is a self and there is an everybody. Now, I want to pause this whole thing for a second. We're going to listen to, I found a bunch of people talking about victim or victor, little snippets of speeches and so forth. I want to play this one brief clip, listen to it, and then we'll come back to what's being offered here, please.
Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the difference between a victim mentality and a victor mentality. See, here's the thing. You can't control what happens to you in life, but you can control whether you receive it as a victim or a victor, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Let's just kind of map this out. A victim mentality says, look what you did to me, and a victor mentality says, look what I did for myself. A victim mentality desires comforting lies, and a victor mentality desires unpleasant truth. A victim mentality says, I can't succeed because everyone is against me. But a victor mentality says, I will succeed, even if the entire world is against me. A victim mentality looks outward, and a victor mentality looks inward. A victim finds an excuse. A victor finds a way. A victim mentality makes you defensive and discouraged, and a victor mentality helps to get you motivated and makes you want to get to work. A victim mentality accepts human nature, and a victor mentality fights human nature. A victim mentality makes you think you're getting attacked, and a victor mentality makes you think you're getting pushed to greater things. A victim says, just leave me alone, and a victor says, keep making me better. And for a victim mentality, the outside influence is strongest, while for the victor mentality, the internal influence is what really matters. Listen, guys, it's your choice. You can either be a victim or a victor in life. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control your response to it.
Now, there's some truth in what he says, especially on the victim side. The victim takes things and they almost oppress themselves. They like it that way. It helps define it. It gets them attention. It helps them navigate their way through their relationships and their circumstances, and it's who they become. And we've known people like this. Sometimes we might even be people like that once in a while. Now, I don't want us to. I get the idea that we should never be affected by the things around us. You know, there are times to grieve, and there are times to mourn, and there are times when we are oppressed, and there are times when we despair. These are all part of what it means to live here on this earth. There are times when we're angry about things. And there are times when we feel oppressed. You know, it's all part of that. But where do we land with it? Where is it? How do we deal with all of that? Now, on the victor side, he keeps talking about, you know, you look inward. You have this internal strength, and you decide what you're going to do. Well, there's some truth in that also. But there's a very subtle trap. And I was surprised at how many times I kept seeing this same message in these different video clips I watched through the week. This idea that it's all me. It's all what I can do. It's not just about a choice. It's about finding that inner strength. And I thought about that. And the way my brain works, I went back to my old philosophy learnings, and I'll try to keep this brief and simple. René Descartes, the French philosopher, soldier, and theologian, and everybody did everything back in those days, you know. He wrote this book that came up with this famous sentence. You ever heard of it? I think, therefore I am. Probably heard of it somewhere. His basic line of thought was, if I can think, and I know I can think, if I know I'm thinking, then something must be doing the thinking. And since I'm the one who's thinking, then it must be me. And if I can think, if I know I'm thinking, then I also know I exist. Makes sense, right? I think, therefore I am. Hundreds of years earlier, St. Augustine of Hippo out of North Africa, back in around 300-ish or so, early days of the church, he had something similar, except he said it this way: if I think and I know I can think, God must have made me. God must have made me. So what Descartes did was, I know I exist because I know I'm thinking. He goes on from there to say, because I know I'm thinking, then I can prove that God must exist too, because something had to make me. All right? It's hard to argue with that entirely. The difficulty, the subtle difficulty in that is, God's existence is therefore dependent on us to create him out of our thought. See what I mean? So what Descartes did was write this to the church because the church was beating science down. Galileo and all those guys, the church was saying, you guys, this is not accurate. This is not the way it works. We get something different from the Bible. And Descartes writes this as a way of saying, hey, can you help me understand this? Because this is what makes sense to me. And what he essentially did was separate religion and science. That's where it started. That's where it started in our culture, where the separation of religion and science came in. Augustine, on the other side, he was much a scientist in his own way, in the best way he could be in the 300s. Nothing like what we do now. But he still had room to understand that God is the source of all things, whatever that science leads us to. It's a battle that still goes on today. Still goes on today. Stephen Hawking, brilliant, brilliant man, who understands that if you see the world or knowledge as a circle, and every time there are gaps in the circle, we've used God to fill those gaps in. But when we know something, we learn something else, then we have less need for God. Whereas David Wilkerson, a British astronomer, will say this way. He says, every time that we learn something new about science and fill one of those gaps, then we learn something more about the God who created the world. Very different pictures. How does that fit to victim and victor? The victim says that I will make my way based on the idea that I am oppressed and downtrodden, and that's what I want to be. But the victor says something different. I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that. Now what happens is here becomes a very critical place. Charlottesville, for instance, we saw a lot of people who claimed they were victims. Two different sides, both claiming to be victims, clashing violently because they each wanted what they wanted. Who's talking? Who's trying to understand anything? What happens when one side wins over the other? It seems to me, in my observation, this is my observation of history and events like this, when a victim takes, in this kind of a circumstance, a victim takes what they want, they become bullies. Because that's what they've learned. I get what I need and I keep what I need by force. This is the future I think Malcolm X offered from the 60s. Martin Luther King Jr. said, this is about everybody. This is about everybody. One of the interesting things about that movement was so many people had been convinced that they were less than human, that they did not deserve more. The biggest struggle in that movement for the civil rights movement under King's leadership was understanding that we do not have to be victims, but we don't have to make someone else less. We can be somebody. I can be somebody without making somebody else less. This is a magnificent thought in my mind. And they had very simple ways to go about it. Simply having people repeat over and over the idea, I am somebody. They had rallies with people in large groups, and one leader would shout out, I am, and they would repeat it back. I am. Somebody. I was far too young to be involved with that, but when I was in youth work in the 80s in Georgia, a man named Cornelius Henderson, who had been a part of the civil rights movement, did this at a youth rally of about 900 kids, and it was one of the most stirring things I've ever experienced in my life. It was amazing. 900 kids, adult leaders, about 1,000 people there all together. And he had this big, one of those big, deep, booming voices, kind of like R.A. He said, oh, everybody loves to hear R.A. read because he's got that authority sound, right? And Cornelius would shout out, I am! Like that. And it got our attention. We didn't know it was coming. He just said, repeat after me, and then he did it. And we kind of walked, I am. And he said, somebody. Well, after a while, it kept getting bigger and bigger. And we're about 80% white folks, and we're getting stirred up. But it didn't take anything away from anybody else. Back in the 80s, there was a movement in Latin America, Central and South America. It didn't last very long. It's called liberation theology. And the whole idea behind liberation theology, roots in the 70s, moving up into the 80s, was just like Malcolm X. If we deserve something, if we need to be equal even, we have to take it. We have to take it. Didn't last very long. What is it that we're going to get from God by taking it? God says, I have life for you. Do we get that by taking it? Are we worthy of that? We can't even earn it. We can't even live lives strong enough, good enough to follow the law well enough to earn salvation. It only comes to us as a gift from the all-powerful God. Taking doesn't work. Ultimately, taking can't work. We took freedom from Britain. It didn't end there, did it? We did not end up in a relationship with England where we got stronger so we could push them around. Despite those early tensions, eventually we have now become, is anybody questioning, are they not the best allies we have? It seemed to me like they are. I remember after 9/11, I never watched C-SPAN. Just me. But for some reason I was one day, and I was watching the British Parliament, and Terry Blair was the Prime Minister. And I remember him saying, just like the U.S. did not desert us in our time of need in World War II, we will not desert them now. Almost exact words. That's not about taking. Sometimes we have to grow into relationships that work. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that helps Peter think about this decision, this time. But ultimately, it's the love commandments. You remember that the rich man comes up to Jesus and he says, what do I have to do to be right with the law? Jesus, or to be right with God? I will obey the law. But he pushes it a step further. The rich man, he says, but what do I have to be perfect? Perfect. He changes his word to that. And Jesus says, well, if you want to be that, then give up everything you've got and follow me. And the man went away sad because he was very rich. And then Jesus says it's harder for rich people to make it to heaven, even than a camel to get through an eye of a needle. So the rich man goes away a victim. I can't do this. He chose that, didn't he? He chose that. Jesus didn't even ask that of him. He said, you're doing what you're supposed to do. Man says, I want more. It's about me, isn't it? That's about the self. Jesus gives Peter this choice. Who are you going to be? I want you to follow me. Jesus knew every failure Peter had made. He knew every fault. He knew Peter could be somewhat erratic in his moments of choice and decision and behavior. But he knew in his heart Peter wanted to be right with Jesus. And we know the story, don't we? Peter led the church. The book of Acts is all about Peter and Paul and some others, but Peter and Paul mostly. The Acts of the Apostles, Peter and Paul, in establishing Christianity. See, the difference is the victor follows Jesus. Now, we can't go find documents that say we're, back in history, we were a Christian nation. And nobody ever said that. We have freedom of religion. But we were founded by Christian people. Not always the founding fathers. The people who tilled farms did as much to found this country as anybody else. They were people of faith. In England, it was John Wesley and his brother Charles, largely through their efforts to educate people, to help people pull themselves out of victim kind of status, that changed that country. They're national heroes in England. That's allowed there. If you go into Westminster Abbey, you'll see a plaque. They were actually offered to be buried in Westminster Abbey along with other national heroes, kings and queens and people like that. And they said no, they didn't. But they did put you can go see it. It's a plaque that's got their faces on it. Stone, carved in stone. Because they help people follow God. John Wesley himself thought of himself as a victim because he could not meet what he thought God's expectations were. He saw he was a failure because he could not follow his own understanding of what God expected of him. Until he had that moment, that heart-warming place where he knew that God loved him, period. That's the acceptance that helps us more than anything. That's what Peter understood here. When Peter came through that series of questions, do you love me? Yes, and Jesus wasn't satisfied yet. I'm asking you, Peter, how deep does this go? How deep does this go? That's what we have to do in our lives. If we take on the victim, if we become victims, if we allow ourselves, if we choose that, then we are letting other people define who we are. Do you see that subtlety? We're letting other people decide who we're accepting their image of us and making it our own image of ourselves. Jesus looks at Peter and says, I'm not accepting that image that you're dealing with of guilt and failure right now. I want you to be that rock, and I want you to follow me. I know your failures. I know your faults. But I want you to follow me anyway. So do we want to choose the vision Christ has of us? Do we want to choose Jesus' picture of us, what God sees in us? Or do we want to choose what other people see? No matter what that is, good or bad. True victors follow Jesus. Imperfect people in an imperfect world, trying to help one another in connection with Christ. That's it. That's what the church is, the hands and feet of Jesus. Imperfect people in an imperfect world, bound together by their love for God and each other, and working the best we know how to help others find their place in that also. And it's a hard world to do it in. It requires that we love people that are unlovable. That we see people as God's children who don't act like it. People who are willing for enemies to become friends in ways that God leads. It's a challenging place to be. Following Jesus is not easy. In fact, he says to Peter, if you follow me, if you really follow me, the day's going to come when you don't make a choice. You'll be taken. You'll be led to somewhere else, and death will follow. But we have to remember that life follows that. True life is in Christ. Our place is already been assured. By our faith, by our love for God, and by the love God has for us, may we always choose to follow the one who makes us true victors. Amen.